to entertain you in the next 45 minutes talking about my experiences with facilitating distributed retrospectives. I would like to tell you stories about things that went wrong and things that went well. And if you've got something you want to share, then see if you can stop my process of speaking, and then maybe you have a chance to say something, but it's not easy. So a little bit about myself. I do 3 things. I've got my own company called Meta Developer, because I'm not a developer, but I'm developing developers, so I'm a meta developer. I put speakers on. You can't hear me? Oh, can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now? Now? Better? Okay, good. I didn't say anything important yet. So I put speakers on stage. So I'm in the program committee for a lot of developer conferences, like the people that you've seen putting together speakers for this conference. And another thing I do is that I mess with the heads of students. I've been teaching at university for 20 years. That's how I met my husband. He was one of my students. And now I'm teaching the teachers at university how to teach at university computer science. So that's also a bit meta. And I'm actually a stand-in for another speaker tomorrow morning, where I'm going to talk about my experiences with teaching and learning. But what I'm going to talk about today is the third thing that I do. I help developers talk with each other, because I come from a theoretical computer science background, being a developer for some years. And what strikes me is that sometimes developers have a hard time talking to each other about things that go wrong. They have a hard time admitting to failure, and they have a hard time dealing with failure in a way so that they learn from it. And then I stumbled across retrospectives, and I really liked it. And today my talk is about things that can go wrong and how we can avoid it. And the first thing I want to touch upon is assumptions. Because I come from Denmark, and you probably have some assumptions about what are women like in Denmark. I don't know. You don't have to tell me your assumptions, but you probably have some. I know definitely when I go to Australia, people have assumptions that they expect somebody like this when I come to conferences. This is silly. I mean, we're grown-ups, we know that. Not every woman in Denmark looks like that. We're actually very diverse. I mean, this is how we look, really. So we are really different. We're not all like that. And I have a lot of assumptions about you. This is my first time in India, and when I was riding with the tuk-tuk, my assumption was I was going to die very soon. But it didn't happen, luckily. And I have a lot of other assumptions about Indian people. Without really knowing you very well, I've been facilitating distributed retrospectives where we had a lot of developers coming from India, actually sitting in India while we communicated with them. And what I've noticed was that they were very polite. So Danish people are not polite. You know the word we have in English called please. In French it's s'il vous plaît, and in German it's bitte. We just don't have that word in Danish. We don't. When we want the salt, we say, give me the salt. So when I have a meeting with people who come from a very polite tradition, I come across as being very brutal and not very nice. But at least I have the awareness that there's this difference. So I think that assumptions is something which is very important, and we'll come back to that later when it comes to retrospectives. So first, what are retrospectives? Before we talk about distributed retrospectives, you probably know Winnie the Pooh. My assumption is you know Winnie the Pooh. Great. So one of the first things in the book about Winnie the Pooh is like this. Here's Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, 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 bump on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels that there's another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think about it. And that's how I see retrospectives. It's a way of stopping from bumping your head into the stairs and think about how to become better. And in order for us to do that, we have to actually share what is problematic. We have to share things that we need to do differently. But we also have to share the success stories and the things that we can celebrate so that we can improve that way of doing it. So this is retrospectives for me. This is my definition of retrospectives. But what we're going to talk about today is distributed retrospectives. And there are retrospectives and there are distributed meanings. And if we have distributed retrospectives, you can see that in this field there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of suffering, at least from the way I see it. So my first point was actually to make this presentation very short and just don't do them. I mean, this could be the end of this presentation. If you're in a situation where you could just stop right now, facilitating distributed retrospectives and just be together in the same room, you can leave this room right now, because that's the best advice I can give you. Right, I feared as much. So we have to go for the next best solution, right? We have to look at how can we make these retrospectives as good as possible with the things that we have at hand, with the context that we have. We can't really get away with having distributed retrospectives today in this age. So my takeaway messages will be 4 different takeaway messages, and I'll go through them again in the end with more detail. The first is you have to prepare a lot more. Second is you have to insist on support for the people that you are facilitating the retrospective for, but also for the people who are giving the facilities to these people in the meeting. You have to make sure everybody's present, and when I say present, I mean that they're actually actively listening and that they're there to be able to answer questions instead of being on mute and saying, oh, sorry, could you repeat that? And the last thing, you have to follow up on them. And that's the thing that goes for all kinds of retrospectives. If you don't follow up on them, it becomes a waste of time, because people won't do what they decided to do in the action points, and then it is actually a waste of time. So let's dive into it. Because distributed retrospectives are actually just retrospectives, a bit harder, I'll talk about some anti-patterns for retrospectives in general before I go into distributed retrospectives. There's a lot of things that I've seen happening at retrospectives, my own and other retrospectives. And I've decided to write those down as anti-patterns for retrospectives. I'm writing a book about it, but don't hold your breath. I've been writing that book for 3 years now, so it's probably never going to be finished. But I think if I talk enough at conferences, maybe somebody else will write that book about my patterns, and then I don't have to do it. So the first anti-pattern I have is called the prime directive ignorance. This is Norm Kurth. He wrote the first book I read about project retrospectives. He wrote a book called Project Retrospectives, and he actually took the post-mortems and gave them another name, retrospective. So he was the one who coined the term. But the retrospectives Norm talked about were retrospectives after a project was done, and they were 2 or 3 days long. So it wasn't the retrospectives that you probably know from your agile thinking right now by Diana Larsen and Esther Darby that wants to take 2 hours or maybe 1 hour. It's longer retrospectives. But he had a prime directive, which I think is great. Regardless of what we discover, we must understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job he or she could given what was known at the time, his or her skills and abilities and resources available, and the situation at hand. How many of you have seen this before? Good. How many of you are actually using this in a retrospective actively? Good. But the problem is often that people say, I can't believe that this works, because I know that some people are lazy, I know that some people are stupid, I know that some people are not doing their best. So it's a bit like when we had in Star Wars, we had Luke Skywalker together with Yoda, and Luke Skywalker said, I don't believe that I can race this spaceship out of the mud. And Yoda said, that's why you fail. And it's the same with the prime directive. If you don't believe, as a facilitator, that people can come to the retrospective with the assumption that everybody actually did the best they could at that moment when they did it, then you will fail. So the way that I've described the anti-patterns is first, it's like a pattern. You're in a context, you're in a problem. The problem is, it feels awkward to follow the directive. Because if you know developers as a species, you know that they are very interested in finding problems and finding faults, because that's what they do. That's what they do. They find the problems and they solve them. So it's also very easy for them to figure out who has got the problem, who did the wrong thing. But if you go and tell them, we all should love each other and believe the best of each other, they'll think you're a hippie. So they think that it can feel a bit awkward to tell people everybody did the best. So what happens when it's awkward is what we call the anti-pattern solution, which is just forget it. So that's what most people do when they're facilitating a retrospective. It's uncomfortable to make the developers believe this, so I'll just forget it. I won't mention it. I'll just hope that it will work out without me saying anything. But the problem is that there's some consequences. And the consequences is that people bring their assumptions to the retrospective. Like the assumptions you might have had about Danish people and the assumption I have about Indian people, that might not be true. Maybe people have assumption about some people not doing their job because they were lazy or stupid or wanted to do something else, egoistic. Maybe the reason was different. But if they bring the assumptions, they're in the way of people listening to each other and giving them the freedom of speech to say why something actually was hard for them at the moment. The anecdotal evidence is that people don't really listen. And if people don't listen, they also become afraid to go to retrospectives, and then in the end, the retrospectives die. So the refactored solution is to bring the directive to the retrospective in some way. But you can't just take this and put it on the wall and believe that people believe it. You have to work with it. In order for this to work, you need to have trust. You need to have trust in each other. That is hard for a retrospective where people are together in the same room. It's even harder if people are not in the same country or in the same city or even in the same building. So this is something which is a problem for retrospectives, but for distributed retrospectives, even worse so. So when I have a distributed retrospective, instead of just taking this and putting it on the wall, because I can't really do that, there's no wall in a distributed retrospective, I try to build trust. I try to build the trust between the team members. And I do that, for instance, by putting in some extra time in the beginning of a retrospective, where everybody tells a little story from the last sprint. It could be a story from work, but it could also be a story from their personal lives. Actually, stories from the personal lives sometimes are better, because the more you know each other, the more you can laugh at each other and at yourself, the easier it is to trust each other and to actually assume that people have been doing their best. It's all down to everybody likes to be loved, right? Everybody just wants to be loved. So if you can show people that you love them just a little bit, they get happy and they want to share and they trust you. So that's a first anti-pattern. The next anti-pattern is also an anti-pattern I see in a lot of retrospectives. I call it the Wheel of Fortune. It's a difference between symptoms and problems. So for instance, I was at a retrospective where the facilitator had just been on a course to learn about Scrum. And so in the retrospective, they said, well, here's a poster for what to stop doing, here's a poster for what to start doing, and here's a poster for what to continue doing. And people put up a lot of things in the start, stop, continue. And one of the things that came up in the start was to do more pair programming. Well, that's easy, right? We go through the retrospective, and when we come to the end of the retrospective, this one was chosen as one of the things that they should focus on, because everybody thought it was important with pair programming. So they made a plan, a very, very measurable plan that said 3 days a week, everybody should pair program for at least 3 hours. And then they started the next sprint, and it didn't work. So the next retrospective, what happens? Start, stop, continue, we should do more pair programming. And it kept popping up, and it kept not working. And the reason why it kept popping up was that they were dealing with the symptoms of a problem. And that's why I call this the Wheel of Fortune. Because if you put things up like that, and you don't look at the causes behind these things, you might never know whether it's symptoms or it's the actual problems. And that's why the 5 phases of a retrospective is really important. And when I bring this out as one of the anti-patterns I talk about in the distributed retrospectives, is that for distributed retrospectives, this becomes even more of a problem. Because often, when you have that, you're very time constrained. People will say, you have an hour, and you have 10 people, and you just have to go through that retrospective and get me some action points. And what happens when you're pressured like that is that you sort of skip some steps. If we go through the steps of a retrospective, we won't go into this Wheel of Fortune. Because the problem with the Wheel of Fortune is we're all busy, and the retrospectives takes time away from the real work, from the coding, right? The anti-pattern solution is just skip a step or two in the retrospective, and then it'll be faster. The consequences is as I said, things will keep popping up. You will have these Groundhog Day retrospectives because you're only solving the symptoms, but the groundhogs keep coming up from the ground because they're still there underneath. And unless you've found the real problem behind these symptoms, they'll keep popping up in different, sometimes in different disguises. And the refactored solution is to remember to use all the phases, and especially this one, generate insights to find the cause. I know that the people in the back can't see the bottom of the slides, so I'm trying to be aware of that and reading aloud everything it says there. So if it's not good enough, you'll just let me know, and then I'll do better. So what are the 5 phases of a retrospective? Well, the first is setting the stage. And setting the stage is really important because this is where people go away from their desks, they've been in the flow with the programming, and they go into the retrospective, and now we need to tell them this is a different setting. The rules are different here. You can't sit with your phone, you can't toy with your email right now. You have to focus. If you're not speaking, you will be actively listening. And this is also a place where everything we say here stays here. It's like the Las Vegas principle. Everything that happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. How many of you have been to Las Vegas? Yeah, we agree, right? Yeah. It stayed there. And that's the same with retrospectives. And that's one of the things that you have to do in the beginning of a retrospective, setting the stage, making people feel safe in a trustworthy environment. So that's an important one that people often forget. And one of the things that I think is also very important here is that everybody should say something. Even the shy ones who don't want to say something, ask them a question that's reasonably easy to answer. It could be, what was the best thing that happened last week? Describe the last sprint as weather, or on these different, are you happy, sad, or mad about the last sprint, or something like that. Just something that they can answer, because if you allow them to not use their voice in the beginning, it's much easier for them to stay quiet during the whole retrospective. So that's important for setting the stage. The next one is gathering the data. Yeah, and gathering the data, it can be done with a timeline, as I have here. It can be done with the start, stop, continue. It can be done with lots of different things. When I have a distributed retrospective, these are one of the things that I try to make people prepare beforehand. I'm not always lucky with that. They don't always do it. But if you are facilitating a distributed retrospective, you don't have a lot of time. So anything that can be done asynchronously, you should try to make them do asynchronously. And gathering the data in some sort of document, online document, you can do that ahead of time. But sometimes you need support for the people from their team leaders or their scrum masters or whoever sort of looking into what they're doing on a daily basis, because sometimes they have to remind them maybe an hour before the retrospective, please fill in this data. Allow them some time. And also you can do that by telling them, well, we actually have a meeting in half an hour, so please remember to fill in some data. Because these are what some of the things that don't have to be done while we're all online. And the problem is that, you know, if you're at an online meeting and there's a break where you don't have to do something, like somebody maybe put in 2 post-it notes and then they don't have to do anything, they get bored and they think, oh, I can just look at my email or something like that. And then you lose them. So whatever you can do before, try to make them do that before. The generating insights is the phase that I said was so important. Because instead of just taking one of these red notes and working with them, for instance, it could be, we're not doing enough pair programming. In the scenario that I talked about before, in the story, they eventually did a 5 why analysis on this no pair programming. So the 5 why analysis is something that we have taken from psychology or psychotherapy, where they say, why don't we have more pair programming? And then maybe the other one says, well, there's some people who just don't like it. Whenever it's scheduled, they go away, or they go to the toilet, or something like that. Why do they do that? Well, they do that because they feel uncomfortable in a pair programming setting. Why do they feel uncomfortable in a pair programming setting? Because they would rather work on their own. Why would they rather work on their own? Well, because that's their type. Maybe they're that type of introvert that needs to work on their own. And then you know the cause behind that symptom, and then you can work with that. Then you could either address that and say, okay, I know it's comfortable. I know it's not comfortable for you to do this, but you actually can get these benefits out of it. So maybe we should start working with you a little bit. Or maybe there will be these 2 people in the team who will never do pair programming. And they'll miss out on the benefits that come from pair programming, but at least you don't have sort of the expectation that they'll do something that they don't do. So generating insights, either with the 5 why or with the fishbone or something, is very important to figure out what is actually the problem behind this symptom. And I think the interesting thing with doing that is that sometimes for these 3 red things, it could be the same problem that underlies these symptoms. And then instead of focusing on these 3 things, you can focus on one problem instead. So there's a lot of funny things happening when you're actually spending time on looking at the cause. But it's even more difficult to do that in a distributed setting because you feel that you're rushed. And then you need to decide what to do. And deciding what to do, you need to do that while you're talking together. You can't do that asynchronously. And you can do that in all sorts of ways, like dotting or discussing in groups or pairs or something like that. But it's very important to come up with something which is measurable. Some people talk about SMART goals that are described specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. But it has to be some sort of action point where you can go back and see, did we actually do this? Instead of just saying, well, we need to start peer reviewing. Well, that's too vague. We need to say, from Monday, everybody that commits code should at least have one other person reviewing their code. It should be measurable so that you can see whether this experiment was a success or not. And then you close the retrospective. And closing the retrospective is also important, because this is where you say, well, these are the action points that we decided, and this is the time where we will look at these action points again. Maybe some of these we'll look at them in a week, some of them we'll look at the next retrospective. But to let people know that there will be a follow-up on what they decided to do, so that the things that they spent time on won't just disappear. So I would like to take a chance to have a little break where I have a sip of water and you talk to the person next to you about these antipatterns that you've seen just for a minute or 2. And if you don't want to do that, it's perfectly all right. You just send the signal by looking at your phone that you're not interested, all right? So just take 1 or 2 minutes talking about whether this relates to your reality. So I just had the question. I was expecting to come to this talk to see how you actually perform the distributed retrospective, and I will definitely come to that, but I've sort of tried to do it along the way, and then in the end I will summarize how I do it, okay? And there'll be some pointers to technical stuff, but I think that the cultural stuff and the communication stuff is actually the hard part. The technical stuff just has to work, and I have some pointers for that as well, but it depends on what company you're working with, what kind of technology you can use. Okay, but thank you for talking to each other, maybe about this, maybe about something else. Let's dive into the distributed retrospectives. Out of sight, out of mind. When I'm facilitating a retrospective in real life, I often come in as an external facilitator, and they see me coming in with my big bags full of pens and post-it notes and smart paper, and then they know, okay, we have a retrospective now. But if they're sitting at their desk, they can't see me, and thus they forget about me. Hard to believe, right? But they do. They forget about me and the retrospective because they don't have any visual evidence that there's a retrospective coming up. So what happens is, oh, right, we'll start 5 minutes late. But you know what it's like when you say you start 5 minutes late? It's 10, right? And if you start 10 minutes late on the retrospective that takes an hour, and people say, oh, I have a hard deadline here. And when they say I have a hard deadline here, they mean they're not going to leave on the dot, they're going to leave 5 minutes before because they have to go somewhere else. And then suddenly your retrospective, which was 60 minutes, is only just 45 without you changing your plan. And the consequences is, if it's delayed, it'll be shorter, and you don't get the things out of it as you should. And the problem is that if you don't get something out of retrospective, it becomes, as I said, a waste of time, and then you just stop doing it, which I think is extremely sad. The refactored solution is to make people prepare. So what I do is that I make sure that either I or somebody else can actually put the retrospective in people's calendar so that they get whatever they want as a reminder. And then the day before the retrospective, I send out an email to the people who are attending the retrospective, and I say, tomorrow at this time, we'll have this retrospective. Sometimes I give them an agenda, sometimes I give them a theme, But I always try to remember to put in the action points from last time so that they can prepare for what they want to say about the status of these action points. And then 15 minutes before the retrospective, I send out an email again saying this is the time to go get a cup of coffee or a bio break. Because you know what it's like when people come late to a meeting with a Starbucks coffee in their hand, it's just not good, is it? Because you know why they're late then. It's just embarrassing. You wouldn't do that, of course. I know none of you would come with a cup of chai late for a meeting. You'd never do that. But some people do that. So send out things that reminds them. But again, you have to be allowed to send emails to people. So I wanted to show you this video. How many of you have seen this about a meeting, an online meeting created in real life? I'll just show you a few minutes of it. So you can look it up on YouTube. I think it's great, and I think it's depressing. As I said, it's old. Some of you have seen it years before. But has it changed? Not at all. Later in the video, we have somebody whose dog starts barking, and you probably, and baby's crying, and you hear a barista, and then you know they're sitting in a cafe, and then somebody's muted. Sorry about that. Could you please repeat the question? Because they were obviously doing something completely different. So hiding in the corner is one of the distributed retrospective antipatterns. So people can hide from the retro when no one can see them. I think that's a huge problem. If I'm together with people in a room, I really love looking at their body language because I can see whether they're quiet because they don't have anything to say, or whether they're quiet because they're shy or afraid. I can see who they want to agree with by what way their feet are turning. I can see whether they're using their phone. I can see whether they're falling asleep. It has happened. But I can't see that when I'm just having an online meeting like that, as we saw in the video. So what do? Well, we allow people to just relax, and I mean, of course, if nothing is important for you, then you can read your email. We don't want to waste your precious time. But what happens if we allow people to do that? If they're not actively listening, then this is not a team thing. A retrospective should be a team thing. A retrospective should not be about this person should do better or this person should do better. It should be about changing the system. It's not the people that are the problem, it's the system. It's the team's rules or regulations or cooperation. And that's why it's important for everybody to be present all the time, whether they want it or not. So what I do is different things. I always have a piece of real paper next to my computer where I write up the names of all the attendees. And then I have different symbols for when they've said something. So when they've said something in the first round, I give them just a little line. If they share something, I give them a little star. They don't know about this, of course. If they help others in communications, I give them a little heart. Never tell them that. And then if I notice that somebody is consistently silent, I call them out and say, what do you think about this? And if I know that that person is really uncomfortable about being called out, I take the time to make a round where everybody says something. And then I use the little piece of paper to make sure that everybody said something. And that means that people have to be alert all the time because they don't know whether I will ask for a round right now. Another thing that I try to insist on is to have everybody on video. And you probably heard somebody talk about if we have a distributed retrospective where we have a huge group of people and then we have maybe 1 or 3 people outside in another country, then everybody should be distributed. All the people in the room should have their own computer. And I know that there's some controversies about that. But one reason for actually doing it, I think, is that then everybody can be on the video. So that's a problem with a Google Hangout if you're more than 10 people, because then you can't be on a Google Hangout with video, but you can do that with other technologies. You shouldn't be more than 10 people in a retrospective anyway, so it should be a hypothetical problem, but it is not, unfortunately. But to me, it's very important to see people's faces, because if I see people's faces, I can see whether they're shaking their head about what somebody else said, or whether they're smiling or doing this with their eyes if somebody says something. That's very important information to me as a facilitator. And I try to insist on having everybody at video, because then I can also see where they're looking. And if they've got glasses, it's even better, because then I can see reflection of what's on their screens, or if they're looking at the phone. So everybody with glasses, you should remember that. It's really dangerous. My husband's got glasses. Poor him. So to me, that's very important. And you can discuss the technologies to do that. But I've actually just had a team that I was an external facilitator for. And because they thought that the video thing was stupid and ridiculous and didn't want it and didn't need to see other people's faces, I had to say I have to stop my cooperation with you. Because I cannot facilitate a retrospective that feels like a retrospective for me. Because I know, because of my little cheat sheet of paper, 5 people out of 12 never say anything. And I can't figure out why, because I can't see them. I can have discussions with them outside the retrospective, but it's important for me to know. So you can, if you want to be militant like me, you can insist, or you can just ask politely, depending on what culture you're from. If you're a Viking with a sword, sometimes they just say yes. So there are some technologies to communicate. In the good old days, where I started facilitating retrospectives in about 1997, and distributed retrospectives maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And in the beginning, I always used Skype until Microsoft bought it, at which point it became a bit flaky. I don't know if you noticed that as well. That was sad. But luckily, at the same time, Google Hangout came out. And I love Google Hangout because I like to play. And in Google Hangout, you can actually put hats on and beards on. And if you haven't done your makeup great, you can look like a cat instead or something like that. It's wonderful. If you have a hangover, you can even sort of get rid of that. And you can also, when you have these hats, you can have this, this 6 thinking hats, where you can have a 6 thinking hats retrospective, where you as a facilitator, now you have a white hat on, now you have a yellow hat on, now you have a red hat on, so you know you're talking about feelings, and then everybody can see the hat. It's a bit funny, and it's also giving some meaning to the retrospective. You can also have themed retrospective. Everybody is a pirate and talks like a pirate, just to make it fun. Well, you don't have to be a child like me, but Hangouts are good anyway. But as I said, there's a limit to how many people you can actually see on the video. Then I have some corporations that I have retrospectives with, and they insist on using GoToMeeting, or Microsoft insists on using Zoom with me, and they insist on using their own spreadsheets, things like that. So there's probably a lot of ways to communicate. But as I said, that's not so important. The important thing is that it works. So try it out in the setting with the people, with their internet, and see what works best. And then, of course, to share data. In the beginning, I used Google Docs a lot. So this is my sort of, the Google Doc I've used and copied over and over again, where I say that this is the date, which is really important for people. And then please take a look at what we decided to look at the last retrospective. So these are the action points. They're in the beginning of the retrospective sheet. And then if we need to enter suggestions, we'll do it here. There's a link to an actual spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet, where when they come up with proposals for action points, we put it in there. And I've already prepared then that everybody in the team can vote, because the voting to decide what problem to discuss, or the voting to decide the action point is important. And then I have incidents that happened between the last retrospective and this one, positive, negative, and neutral. And these are the things that I'm urging them to fill out beforehand. But of course, while we're talking, they can still do it. I had an interesting experience with a group of programmers from India, facilitating retrospective, and I was told that they never say anything negative. They're always positive. So we don't really know what the problems are. So I created a Google Doc, and there was no invitation. Everybody with the link could participate. And that means in a Google Doc that you're anonymous. So you show up as a little animal, like an anonymous lion, or an anonymous seal, or an anonymous parakeet, or something like that. And in the beginning, they'd only filled out the positive things, no negative things. But while at the actual retrospective, they could see, okay, now the lion is writing something and the parakeet is writing something. They could actually see that it is anonymous. And then they started filling some very interesting things into this Google Doc. And I realized that allowing people to work in an anonymous way tells them that it is dangerous to speak up. I realize that. But sometimes you have to crawl before you can walk, right? So them seeing that it is okay to share something negative and that we're working with it instead of getting angry actually enabled them later on to become more negative or critical towards the way that we were working. So I like to have the anonymity in the beginning, and then later on when you feel more, sorry, it's not my native language, this English thing. So I like to be anonymous in the beginning, but then when people feel safer, we can do it with names. Another thing that I recently found was Google Drawings. And in Google Drawings, you can prepare a lot of post-it notes and little dots for people with their names. So I put the names of the people in the retrospective here, and then they have 6 post-it notes. And I can give them more post-it notes as we go, and they can copy them as well. But that means that in a way I'm urging them to actually at least write some post-it notes, because if they don't write any post-it notes, it's looking a bit awkward that this is just empty. So for teams that have a problem actually entering things, I use this to make it visible that they're not, if they're not sharing things. And then there's a lot of tools that are focused on distributed retrospectives. This is Scatterspoke, and I've got a link in the last slide with references to a blog post that goes through a lot of these technologies and talks about the benefits and the liabilities, so you can look at that. So what I like about these is for a newbie facilitator, it's very easy to facilitate the distributed retrospective with these. What I don't like about them is that normally when I facilitate a retrospective, I have an agenda that I don't show, a detailed agenda that I don't show, and then I have a plan B and sometimes even a plan C. Because depending on what comes out, sometimes they have to talk to each other 2 and 2, sometimes they need more time alone, sometimes we need to have another action. So I don't like to be forced into a setting. I like to have my own freedom, but as a beginner, it's really easy to do this, and there are loads of them out there. So the takeaway messages that I went through, hopefully, was prepare, send out reminders, collect data asynchronously, make more than one plan, and test the technical setup. I don't really care what technique you use, but test it in their environment with their computers, with their internet providers. Insist on support. Insist on being supported in that the video is important, that you can actually send calendar invites to the people, and that they get support for preparation, that they get time off to put things in the gathering data. Make sure everybody is there. As I said, make a list of all the names, make rounds, call people out. Follow up, give them an email with action points after the retrospective, and when you send out the new invite, copy those action points again. Schedule a new retrospective before you leave each other, at least with the sponsor of the retrospective, and revisit the action points at the next retrospective. So these are my takeaway messages for you. And I would like you to take a minute individually to think about what I talked about in the last 44 minutes, and write down one thing you want to start doing, one thing you want to continue doing, and one thing you want to stop doing on your phone or your paper, or just sit and look blindly out in the air and think about things you want to think about. But I would like you to reflect on what I talked about, because otherwise, I'm afraid when you leave this room, most of it will be gone, because there's a lot of other things going on. So just take a minute to think about it and write something down.
You're not part of the you are an external perspective. Now the second time, I think that the actions are obviously on the team. They have to take those actions. Now, and typically facilitators do not have control over the actions that are being taken. And then when you come back, and you realize those actions are being taken. What is that situation for your project, or you handle it?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the question was, it's okay with all these action points, and it's okay to revisit them when you come back, but my problem, or luck, is that I'm an external facilitator, and I come back as an outsider, and then they asked them, so what happened with the action points? And then they said, we didn't, this one we didn't quite do. And this one we sort of forgot. And this one, I couldn't do that either. And then sometimes, if it happens the first time, I'm just supportive and I'm saying, okay, well, I understand, you're under pressure. If it's something that's recurring, again, it's always hard to answer these questions because it depends on the situation and the people. But if I see it recurring, what I normally do is that one of my plan Bs or plan Cs is like, okay, well, let's look at the causes for why this happened. Because if people say, well, we just didn't get it done, and if you take a 5 why, then perhaps something peculiar pops up. The testers didn't know what to test because nobody told them. The product owner didn't have access to the customer. Something interesting pops up. So instead of just saying to the team, you haven't done what you should do, you didn't do your actions, I have to look into myself and use the prime directive on these people and say, there was probably a very good reason for why you didn't do these action points. Let's look at that. During. Yeah, so the 5 whys I do during. And if I have a problem with the action points, I just change the retrospective. No, I normally don't. It's almost always a surprise for me. Maybe it would be a good idea for me to ask them what happened before. Thank you. I'll do that. And you had a question?
There is a perspective that having retrospective of each sprint.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
How short
Yeah, okay. So the question was, there's been talk about having retrospective after each sprint can be overkill, and maybe even more so with these strategic retrospectives. I'll just answer this question, and if there are more questions, I'll answer them afterwards, okay? So it's not that I don't want any more questions, but I'll just stop after this one. When people ask me how short can a retrospective be, I normally... Oh, how often? How often? Sorry. Yeah, so... Well, I'd say for most people, if they have a 2-week retrospective, if you have a 2-week sprint, they should have a 1.5 hour, maybe 2 hour retrospective after each 2 weeks. But I know that some people, for instance, those that I'm an external facilitator for, they have a bigger retrospective every month with me, and then they have only an hour after each sprint. And there are also some people who have half an hour after each week, where they prepare asynchronously in their group, like with the happy index and gathering data, or they have a real-time timeline where they can always put up post-it notes. So it depends. But I think that at least after each sprint, you need to look yourself in the eye and reflect. But then again, I love retrospectives. I'll take the question afterwards if that's okay, because I would like. So here are the references, they'll be in the slides, and they're references to the books that I love, to different Antipatterns for retrospectives, not the ones that I made. And then, as I said, the tools for distributed retrospectives and all sorts of things. And I think that if I give my slides to Naresh, I'll give them to the conference, and then they'll send it out to you or something like that. I don't know exactly what will happen, but I'm sure something good will happen. And if not, you saw my Twitter handle on the first, and you can just harass me until I send them to you, okay? So thank you for your time.